So this happened to a classmate of mine, and his name was Cody. This was around sometime maybe in 2008, and Cody was around maybe 11 years old at the time of the story. This is definitely one story that really pretty much gets to him every time he thinks about it. Now, Cody was living with his grandparents at the time, as his parents unfortunately were going through some issues and they couldn't afford to have Cody live with them, so they end up having the grandparents to look after Cody. Now, at the time, Cody did have decent grandparents who were from their mother's side. His father's side, his grandparents from his father's side, obviously were out of state. So at this time, Cody was alone. But of course, he had his grandparents. It was one day after school when he got home that his grandparents were going to be in the Bahamas for at least a week. Now, for the first night, nothing had really happened, and Cody was fine with being home alone. He had an older sister who was 18, and she was basically living with the grandparents as well. So Cody and his sister were at home, and they decided to play some video games. Cody didn't have any schoolwork, so he agreed to playing the video games. As Cody was playing the video games, he basically was playing with his sister, when all of a sudden he ended up hearing what seemed to be a knock at the door. Now the girl happened to be his sister, was confused, so she goes up to see if someone was really at the door. But when she looked, she couldn't find anybody. And it was very strange, since that there was someone around, but there was no sign of the person around the area, which kind of shocked. Now that's when of course, Cody looks over at his sister and said that there was someone outside. They looked to see that there was someone standing in their driveway. Whatever this person was looked like they were wearing a hoodie, but since it was so dark, they couldn't really tell who the person really was or stuff like that. It really got to them, and they obviously started to feel uncomfortable by this. Now, Cody was unsure as to what to do, but they stared at this man who happened to be standing in the driveway. He wasn't looking at them or even acknowledging that they were there, so they stayed there for quite a while. Now, Cody's sister went to the bathroom to call 911, and Cody just stood there, praying to God that this man would just leave. This man, however, turns around and runs off into the next direction of the street. By the time the police arrived, the man was already gone, and there was no evidence of the man of who he showed up. But of course, that was something that really freaked out Cody. Who was that man? What did he want? That was obviously something that Cody really got shocked to this day. He didn't really know what this person was really doing or what their intentions were. But of course, the police said they would patrol the area. Of course, Cody ended up talking to his grandma and lets her know about this man, and they had said to Cody not to let anybody in that night. And that was what they had to do. But however, nothing like that has ever happened since, and Cody is now more cautious and more aware of what potentially could have happened. This man could have looked into breaking into the house, or at least do something, God knows what. Cody doesn't even want to know. It still gets to him to this day every time he thinks about it. But what was this man's intentions were was totally unknown. Now, to give it a bit of context as to what made this horrifying, this actually happened to one of my friends named Andrew. Now, Andrew happened to be maybe in grade 8 at the time of this story, and this took place in 2010. It was sometime during the springtime, and Andrew was going to be by himself since his parents both worked the night shift. Now, most of the night shifts went really good, and Andrew was fine staying home alone as he never had any issue with being home alone, but he really enjoyed being alone and getting to do what she wanted. However, though, she ends up looking, and of course, Andrew looks over to see that his sister was about 17, so a little older. So he and his sister were pretty much alone, and they really didn't do too much stuff. They pretty much just do their homework and then go on about their day. Nothing really bad has happened or anything like that. However, though, something really strange began to happen, and it was just shortly after the mom had went to go do her night shift. Now, that's when at the time that Andrew and his sister basically were going now on about their day and doing their own thing when it comes to stuff. However, Andrew was asleep and his sister was up doing homework. As Andrew was asleep, it was around midnight when Andrew woke up hearing knocks. He was confused and asked his sister if she was knocking, and she said no. So he thanked her and decided to go back in the house. As she goes back in the house, as she went back in the house from being outside, having a smoke, obviously, Andrew heard the knock again in his bedroom. He was confused and wondered where the knocking was coming from. He ended up looking around the bedroom to make sure there was nobody hiding in there, and there wasn't anyone there. That's when he ends up looking and finding out that apparently something had really showed up. Apparently, what happened was there was definitely someone in there, but of course, there was someone in the closet, which kind of freaked Andrew out. As soon as Andrew saw that, he obviously got afraid and ended up going over to his dad's house. When he was going to his dad's house, he ends up looking around. His dad's house doesn't live that far, but he did scream help. And when Andrew did scream help outside, the neighbors called the police, and they eventually found that there was a man hiding in the basement. Now, this man, however, happened to get in the house through a key, and which is why he had been able to sneak in. Now, this man was eventually arrested, and it turns out he had been wanted for going into people's properties and pretty much was a home squatter. Of course, there was no evidence into if this guy was even alive or not, but he doesn't even want to know. It really freaked him out to this day, knowing that whoever this man was obviously someone that was obviously they didn't know. However, that's just been the case for a lot of things. Now, at the time of this story, this was around the time when school was pretty much just let out for the spring break. So nothing like that has ever happened, but it still frightens Andrew to this day. He was confused as to why this man targeted him, but I'm afraid that's going to be a question that is never going to get answered. He still is now being more careful and makes sure all doors are locked so nothing like that ever happens again. And so far, nothing like that has ever happened since. But he does get frightened to this day whenever he talks about this story. He wasn't sure if he would be alive today if he had not said anything, but thankfully, someone did get the police in time. Now, just to give it a bit of context, this isn't really the type of story to make you jump out of your seat, but it's definitely one story that really gets to me. It happened one of the nights back sometime during the global pandemic, and I was basically sleeping in my room doing nothing. I don't usually do a lot, so it definitely makes it a lot of stuff that I personally do, but at the same time though, I had nothing like that ever happen until something happened that one day that will forever change my mind. I end up looking over and realizing that there was definitely someone in there that I obviously didn't know about. But however, it kind of frightened me knowing that apparently someone was around. I basically looked over and ended up looking quite odd. I didn't even know what it was, but I felt obviously cold. It was half decent weather, so it shouldn't be freezing. But I was just more confused as to why this happened so quickly. I ended up checking the heat, and the heat was at the same temperature as usual. So I just brushed it off. However, that wasn't the case when something apparently went wrong, and I do notice that I heard what sounded like a voice. I heard what sounded like my mom's voice calling my name. I end up going outside and looking around, but I couldn't see anybody, so there was no I had no idea. I had no idea if someone was calling me, but it wasn't until I ended up hearing what sounded like my mom calling my name. I go to my bedroom to see my mom watching TV, and I asked her if she had heard that, and she said, "Heard what?" She basically know that she wasn't calling me, and I told her, "Were you calling my name?" She said, "No, I wasn't." It obviously really freaked me out, knowing that apparently what I experienced that day was most likely completely paranormal. I still even hear voices like that every once in a while, but I always know that it's just my parents with my mom's ghost. Now, I don't usually believe in paranormal, but after this story, I really don't know what to think.